Hello there, traveler. Settle your breath, ease your shoulders, and let the quiet of the night gather around you. The fire is low, the world is still, and you have wandered once more into the soft echoing halls of the north, where history drifts like smoke, and stories wait patiently in the shadows. Tonight, we return to an age reshaped by flame, an age when England's coasts trembled, and the North discovered just how much power the world beyond could offer. A single raid had changed everything, and the ripples of that moment would spread farther than any chieftain could yet imagine. Before we begin, if these journeys through time bring you peace, consider subscribing to join our growing circle of wanderers. And tell me, softly, if you wish, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your footsteps make this long road feel a little less lonely. Now breathe deeply. Let the sound of distant waves guide your thoughts. Our story continues. The longships returned at dusk. Far across the darkening sea, their silhouettes appeared first as thin strokes of shadow against the last pale blush of the sky. The fjord, quiet through most of the afternoon, stirred as watchers along the rocky shore leaned forward, squinting into the fading light. Mothers pressed children close. Old men straightened their backs, and young warriors, too young to have sailed, but old enough to dream, lifted their chins with awe. The raiders had come home. Their oars dipped in steady rhythm, cutting the water with that unmistakable confidence of men who had seen the world and taken what they wished from it. Every stroke glimmered with evening firelight. Every ripple carried rumors of what waited on their decks. Treasure stolen from the monasteries of England, treasure unlike anything most of the North had ever seen. As the ships drew nearer, the first sounds reached the shore. Laughter, shouts, the clatter of shields, and the raw, unrestrained pride of men who had won more than victory. They had tasted wealth, real wealth, and its presence clung to them like smoke. The first ship scraped against the wet stone. Warriors leapt off, their boots splashing in the shallow water. Salt clung to their hair. Their faces were wind-chapped and sun-darkened, but their eyes burned with a fire that had not been there before. One raider stepped forward, lifting a heavy sack. With a triumphant grin, he loosened the cord and spilled its contents onto the ground. Silver. Dozens of bright coins clattered across the stone, catching the firelight as they rolled. Children gasped. Women covered their mouths. Even the eldest among them, those who had survived harsh winters, famine, and storm, felt their breath catch. Never had they seen so much wealth gathered in one place. The raider lifted a second sack. This one held something stranger still. A golden chalice, hammered by monks for sacred hands, now held casually by a man who had stolen it with bloodied fingers. It glowed as though it carried its own sun. A murmur spread through the gathering crowd, equal parts awe, disbelief, and something more dangerous. Hunger. The North had always known hardship. It had always carved its existence from stone and ice. But now it tasted possibility. The chieftain stepped forward, his fur-lined cloak stirring in the cold breeze. He was a broad man, his beard braided with small bones and bits of iron. His eyes narrowed as he studied the treasure laid before him, and for a moment, the flames in the nearby torches reflected in his gaze with a strange intensity. This wealth could buy cattle, could buy alliances, could buy warriors, hundreds of them. But more than that, it could buy power. The raiders, seeing his fascination, began unloading more sacks from the ships. Silver arm rings, broken jewelry, gilded book covers ripped from their bindings, reliquaries pried from altars and coins. So many coins that the ground soon glittered like a star-strewn sky. The villagers pressed closer. Their voices blended into a breathless hum. Is this all from one place? Is England truly so weak? Did they not fight back? Will you go again? The raiders exchanged knowing looks. One of them stepped forward, a younger man, lean and sharp-eyed. His voice carried easily over the restless crowd. They prayed to their god, he said. But their walls were thin and their warriors fewer still. They never thought men like us would cross the sea. He lifted a strip of embroidered cloth, stolen from a church altar, and let it flutter in the wind like a banner. They never believed the North would come for them. A ripple of excitement ran through the listeners. What had once seemed an impossible journey was now a proven path. What had once been a distant dream now lay glittering at their feet. More ships arrived, each loaded with treasure. More warriors returned, carrying not just spoils but stories. Tales of unguarded monasteries, soft-clothed monks, and villages that crumbled at the sight of Viking sails. Tales that lit the imaginations of every youth standing on the shore. As the evening deepened, torches were lit along the waterfront. Their warm glow flickered across piles of gold and silver like dancing fire spirits. The smell of the sea mixed with wood smoke, mead, and anticipation. Inside the chieftain's hall, a great feast was prepared to honor the raiders. The massive wooden doors swung open, spilling light onto the night-clad earth. People entered in waves, raiders first, then villagers, then wandering skalds eager to immortalize the moment. The hall was alive with sound, laughter echoing against carved beams, the crash of horns raised in celebration, the deep thrum of drums tapping out a heartbeat for the North itself. Fire crackled in the central hearth, casting shadows that danced along the walls like ancient spirits. And everywhere silver glimmered. It lined the tables. It weighed down warriors' belts. It reflected in the eyes of children who had never dared imagine such riches. The chieftain rose, lifting a horn carved with swirling knotwork. The hall quieted. "Tonight," he said, his voice deep and commanding, "we celebrate not just the return of our warriors, but the dawn of a new age." He paused, letting the words settle. "England is weak, its treasures are many, and the sea favors us. The gods favor us." A cheer thundered through the hall. He raised the horn higher. "Let this be the first of many voyages. Let this be the beginning of our rise." The crowd roared. Mead sloshed. Warriors struck their shields in fierce approval. But not everyone in the hall celebrated with such abandon. In the back near the wall, a young man sat quietly, his gaze fixed not on the silver or the mead or the jesting warriors, but on the horizon beyond the open door, where the cold night stretched out like an unspoken promise. He saw what others did not. This was no mere victory. It was a turning point. The treasure was not just wealth. It was fuel. Fuel for ambition, for war, for destiny. The North had taken its first step onto a path that would change the world. And though no one knew his name yet, one day, the songs of the North would remember him. For now, he simply watched, silent and thoughtful, as silver glittered in the firelight. Silver that would reshape everything the Vikings believed, everything they sought, everything they fought for. The age of survival was ending. The age of conquest had begun. The morning after the longships returned, the village woke to a world that felt slightly altered. The air held the same crisp bite of northern autumn. The gulls circled and cried as they always had. The waves still pressed gently against the stone shore, whispering familiar secrets. Yet beneath these unchanged rhythms lay something new, something restless and electric, like an unseen storm building just beyond the horizon. People moved differently. Men walked with a straighter spine, glancing toward the sea as though waiting for it to open another door. Women spoke in quiet tones about England, about monasteries filled with gold, about lands where warriors slept soundly under soft roofs and never expected northern sails to darken their shores. Even the children, who played among the rocks and driftwood, mimicked the raiders, swinging sticks like axes, shouting orders as they pretended to leap from imaginary ships. A single raid had become a story, and the story was becoming a belief. In the days that followed, the village became a place of gathering. Travelers arrived from neighboring settlements, drawn by the songs of wealth and victory. They came to see the treasure, to hear the tales firsthand, and to weigh the old world they knew against the new one this raid had revealed. The raiders were happy to share their stories. One group sat near the waterfront, their backs warmed by the rising sun. They described the English coast, soft cliffs, green fields, and rivers that glimmered like polished steel. They spoke of monks who fled in terror, of walls that crumbled at a single push, of riches left unguarded as though the gods themselves had offered them freely. Others gathered around the blacksmith's forge, recounting the strange architecture of stone churches, the towering crosses, and the quiet halls where gold lay in gentle pools of candlelight. They described the ringing of church bells, a sound unlike anything heard in the north, and how the silence that followed seemed almost holy. But the most repeated story, the one that truly took hold, was not about the gold or the chalices or the jeweled books. It was the story of ease. Warriors returned from England not with tales of narrow escapes or desperate battles. They returned with tales of astonishment. It was as though the world had forgotten to fear us, one raider said, shaking his head in disbelief. We set foot on their shores, and the land was quiet. The first village we found. They did not even bar their doors. Another chimed in, a grin spreading across his face. Their priests ran before we drew our swords. Their only defense was prayer. Laughter echoed through the gathering. The idea, the dangerous, intoxicating idea, began to take root. If it was so easy once, could it not be just as easy again? The chieftains, too, listened to these stories. Their faces betrayed little, but inside their minds, gears began to turn. They saw more than treasure, they saw opportunity. The north was a place of scarcity, of hard soil and cold winters. But England was a place of abundance. Even the elders, who had survived too many winters to be easily swayed, felt the pull of this revelation. One old man sat outside his home, the lines on his face deepened by the flickering light of the hearth. He stroked his beard slowly as he listened. In my youth, he murmured, we sailed for fish, for furs, for trade. We fought only when we had to. But this is a new age. He looked toward the sea, eyes distant and reflective. The world beyond our shores has grown soft. And those words spread through the village like a quiet prophecy. Days passed, but the excitement did not fade. Instead, it sharpened. Warriors polished their shields until the metal shone like winter ice. They inspected their axes, feeling the edge with a solemn reverence. Young men who had never sailed before now begged to join the next expedition, promising loyalty, strength, and untested courage. The longships themselves seemed to wait impatiently, lean, hungry silhouettes resting on the tide. Their carved dragon heads watched over the village with wooden patience, as though listening to the whispers of ambition rising from the halls and houses. The skalds sensed this shift more keenly than anyone. They crafted new verses, letting their words drift through the air like embers. From the west, the silver comes, carried by the sea's breath. From the north, the fire rises, carried by the hearts of men. Their songs wove through the evenings, mingling with the crackle of fire and the scent of pine. Every note carried the same message. The world was opening, and the Vikings were stepping through. In the midst of all this change, the young warrior who had watched quietly in the hall now walked the shoreline alone. His footsteps left shallow imprints in the damp sand. The wind lifted strands of his hair as he studied the horizon. He had heard the stories too, but he did not dream of gold for its own sake. He saw something deeper, something that few others recognized. This raid had shown the North what was possible. But possibility was only the beginning. The true transformation would come not from taking wealth, but from using it. Across the fjord, he could see the chieftain's hall glowing with activity. Meetings, arguments, strategies forming like storm clouds. Leaders were beginning to think beyond this single victory. They were beginning to consider what it meant to control wealth, to command loyalty, to expand influence. The young warrior closed his eyes, letting the cool ocean air steady his thoughts. The North was stirring. Change was creeping into every conversation, every firelit gathering, every whispered hope. And deep within the bones of the land, beneath the stone, beneath the frost, beneath the long memory of the mountains, a slow rumble began to rise. History was shifting, not with the crash of a blade or the roar of battle, but with the quiet sound of ideas taking root. Ideas born from a single raid. Ideas that would lead to more sails on the horizon, more fires on distant shores, more wealth pouring into hungry hands. The raid on England had been a spark, Now the fire was spreading, and the Vikings, for the first time, were beginning to understand their own power. Prosperity arrived quietly at first, not with trumpets or proclamations, but with glances exchanged across firelit halls, with hushed conversations behind closed doors, with the soft clink of silver that now appeared in places it had never been before. The wealth taken from England did not simply fill the chests of raiders. It began to seep into the very foundations of the North. A woman wrapped her newborn in cloth embroidered with gold thread cut from an English altar. A fisherman paid for a new boat with silver coins stamped with a king's unfamiliar face. A blacksmith traded for iron using pieces of a melted chalice, the metal still carrying hints of sacred art. Slowly, subtly, the world was changing, but prosperity, like fire, warmed and burned in equal measure. The chieftain's hall became the center of all movement. Men came from distant villages to offer gifts and pledge loyalty. They admired the treasure laid out on wooden tables, coins sorted into neat piles, ornate crucifixes stripped of gemstones, rings that once adorned foreign priests. Yet every visitor also felt something colder beneath the surface. Silver had weight, not just in the hand, but in the heart. The chieftain, once respected for his steady leadership, now carried himself differently. His eyes lingered too long on the treasure, calculating, measuring. He spoke softly, but his voice held new authority. Authority purchased not through lineage or wisdom, but through wealth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge of the mountains, he summoned his closest warriors. They gathered around the central fire, their faces lit with shifting gold. "You have brought great honor to our people," he began, his tone warm but measured. "And with this treasure, we can build a future our fathers never dreamed possible." The warriors exchanged proud smiles. The chieftain continued, "But we must be cautious," he warned, letting the fire crackle as a pause settled. "Wealth draws not only admiration, but envy." The men grew still. Already, neighboring clans send messengers, seeking alliances, or demanding a share of what we have earned. And some— his eyes narrowed, glinting in the firelight. "Some whisper that we have taken more than is our due." A murmur rippled through the circle. The chieftain leaned forward. "Prosperity comes with a price. To keep what we have gained, we must be stronger than ever." Stronger. The word hung in the air, heavy, necessary, undeniable. For while silver brought opportunity, it also brought tension. In the following weeks, the chieftain began distributing wealth strategically. He gifted arm rings to the fiercest warriors, ensuring their loyalty. He rewarded certain families with coins for their allegiance. He offered precious trinkets to forge new alliances with rival villages, masking them as gestures of friendship. But beneath these gifts lay quiet intentions. Each ring a tether, each coin a promise, each jeweled relic a step toward greater power. Not everyone was pleased. Some grumbled that the chieftain had grown greedy. Others complained that the silver was not shared equally. A few muttered darkly that perhaps the raid's success had gone to his head. But none spoke too loudly. Power had a way of silencing dissent. Meanwhile, prosperity began to reshape the daily rhythms of life. Where once the people had worked tirelessly for survival, now they found themselves dreaming. Dreaming of better homes, larger herds, richer feasts. Dreaming of voyages not for need, but for ambition. And with those dreams came desire. Desire for more gold. Desire for more land. Desire for more control. As the hunger for wealth spread, so too did the seeds of rivalry. Two young warriors argued one morning over the division of spoils, voices loud enough to echo across the fjord. A blacksmith refused a trade with an elder, insisting that English silver was worth far more than local goods. Even within families, tension stirred, sons asking why fathers had not earned as much as their neighbors. Fathers wondering if they should sail next time, despite their age. The North had survived famine, storms, and war, but it had never faced prosperity. Prosperity, it seemed, carried its own storms. One night, as the wind howled outside the chieftain's hall, a skald performed a new verse. His voice was low, rhythmic, like the sea at midnight, Gold warms the hands, but chills the bones. Silver binds men together and tears them apart. A treasure won is a burden carried. His words drifted into the rafters, mingling with the smoke. Some nodded solemnly. Others dismissed the warning. But the young warrior, the quiet one with storm-lit eyes, listened intently. He understood the heart of the matter. The silver taken from England was more than treasure. It was a doorway, one that could lead to unity or to ruin. The next morning, he walked through the village, observing the subtle shift in its movements. Children still played, but now they chased each other with pretend rings of wealth on their arms. Merchants still bartered, but their eyes darted to the chieftain's hall more often than to their wares. Warriors still trained, but their conversations were no longer about honor or duty, they were about opportunity. He paused by the water. The long ships reflected across the gently trembling surface. Prosperity had not just changed the village. It had changed the meaning of power. Once, strength came from how well a man wielded his axe, how bravely he faced the storm, how fiercely he defended his people. But now strength came from how much silver he held, from how many warriors he could buy, from how widely his gifts spread through the fjords. This new power was sharper than any blade because it cut silently. The young warrior looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the sea in a broad, unbroken line. Somewhere beyond that line lay England, still soft, still unprepared, still overflowing with treasure. He realized then that the price of prosperity was not just conflict within the north. It was the compulsion to return, to sail again and again, to seize more, to feed the growing hunger that no chieftain could now ignore. Prosperity demanded its own maintenance, and wealth won in blood often required more blood to keep. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of salt and cold iron. He breathed deeply, understanding what this meant. The raid on England had been the beginning, but prosperity was the chain that would pull the Vikings back toward foreign shores. Not because they needed to survive, but because they needed to rise. And in that realization, the young warrior felt the first stirring of destiny within him, quiet, certain, and unyielding. The silver that flowed through the north did more than change its halls and markets. It changed its sons. Before the raids on England, a young man grew into adulthood through hardship. His strength came from splitting frozen logs, guiding stubborn livestock through snowdrifts, and surviving winters that bit as sharply as steel. His dreams were small, shaped by the narrow geography of survival. If he was lucky, he earned a place among his father's warriors, stood guard at the chieftain's feasts, or sailed only as far as the neighboring coast for trade. But now the world felt wider. The young watched the returning raiders with reverent eyes, not just because they brought wealth, but because they brought possibility. They returned taller somehow, their shoulders broad with triumph, their voices full of stories that reshaped the limits of imagination. They spoke of seas that opened like gates, of lands rich and undefended, of treasures that shone brighter than the moon. They told of men who fell to their knees at the first swing of an axe. They told of the ease, almost absurd ease, with which they carved their names upon foreign shores. And the young listened. Every word was a spark. Every story was a flame. Soon, the fjords echoed with the sound of eager footsteps. Boys who had once trained half-heartedly now rose before dawn to practice throwing spears and swinging wooden swords. They mimicked the stances of men who had fought across the sea, copying every detail with fierce determination. Their bodies changed. Their minds changed. Their ambitions changed. Instead of dreaming of tending their father's fields, they dreamed of longships. Instead of longing for quiet winters, they longed for English treasure. Instead of fearing the unknown, they craved it. Ambition, once a quiet ember, now burned like a forge. One such forge crackled at the edge of the village, where the blacksmith's hammer rang out from sunrise to sunset. His workshop was dim, except for the glow of the furnace that bathed everything in shades of gold and ember red. Young men gathered there, not to watch the blacksmith work, but to witness the transformation that mirrored their own. the birth of sharp purpose from raw iron. The blacksmith's hammer fell with rhythmic certainty. Clang. A strike of direction. Clang. A shaping of fate. Clang. A future sharpened. More blades? He asked one morning, wiping sweat from his brow as a group of young warriors approached with eager eyes. More than before, one replied. The chieftain wants us ready. The blacksmith studied them. These were not the uncertain boys he'd watched grow up. Their hands were calloused from relentless training, their shoulders tense with expectation. They stood as though waiting for the sea to call them by name. You think you're ready to sail? He asked quietly. Another stepped forward, his voice unwavering. We must be. There is no future for a man who stays behind. The blacksmith nodded slowly, not because he agreed, but because he recognized the truth of ambition. It was not something that could be reasoned with or held back. It was the tide, and it would rise regardless of who stood in its way. He picked up a blade newly cooled in water. Steam curled from its edge. Then you must learn one thing, he said, turning the weapon so the firelight danced across it. Iron breaks when shaped too quickly. So do men. But the young only smiled. They believed themselves unbreakable. Beyond the forge, along the cliffs overlooking the sea, groups of young warriors trained relentlessly. Their voices carried through the wind, grunts, shouts, the sharp thud of wooden shields colliding. Sweat darkened their tunics. Their breath rose in clouds as they pushed themselves harder than ever before. Again, one of them ordered after a sparring match ended too quickly. We go again. His partner lifted his shield with trembling arms. You're exhausted, he muttered. We won't be rested when we land on foreign shores. They clashed once more, the sound of their practice echoing like distant thunder. They fought not for glory in that moment, but for the glory that awaited across the sea, for a chance to claim a place among the men who had become legends overnight. Not all trained for war. Some trained for leadership. On a quiet ridge above the training ground sat the young warrior who had watched the silver glow in the chieftain's hall. His gaze was steady, contemplative. He studied not the movements of the fighters below, but the determination burning within them. He saw their ambition, raw and bright, and wondered how it would shape the future. For the first time, he began to understand that this shift was not temporary. This was not a fleeting hunger that would be satisfied with a single raid. No, something deeper was happening. Something irreversible. The young were not preparing to survive. They were preparing to rise. Some sought wealth. Some sought fame. Some sought freedom. But a few, very few, sought power. And power, the young warrior knew, was the most dangerous pursuit of all. He thought of the chieftain's growing authority, of the silver exchanged behind closed doors, of the alliances forged with a smile and a hidden blade. He thought of the way the village now moved. Faster, sharper, more restless. The north itself felt as though it had begun to awaken from a long slumber. Below him, the sun dipped lower, washing the fjord in orange and gold. The young warriors continued their sparring, each strike more deliberate, each retreat more calculated. These men were no longer shaped by winter. They were shaped by ambition, forged not by hardship, but by possibility, tempered not by fear, but by hope, sharpened not by duty, but by a rising fire within that none of them could fully name. The young warrior watched until the last of the daylight faded, until the fighters dispersed, until the waves grew dark and the sky filled with stars. He knew the truth now. The next generation of Vikings would not merely inherit the world. They would chase it, and the path they carved would be drenched in both gold and blood. Wealth changes a man, but the true test of character begins when wealth changes a leader. Long before the raid on England, the chieftains of the north were measured by familiar burdens. How well they fed their people through the cold months, how bravely they stood in battle, how fairly they settled disputes. Their power rose from tradition, necessity, and survival. There was little room for ambition when every winter threatened to erase the work of a lifetime. But the silver that returned with the raiders, that changed everything. It glittered in the chieftain's hall not just as treasure, but as opportunity. a gleaming promise of influence, expansion, and control. And the chieftains smelled it like wolves scenting fresh meat. Where once meetings were calm affairs centered on community needs, now they grew tense, sharp-edged, and layered with quiet calculations. The chieftains no longer spoke of next season's harvest or winter preparations. Their talk circled instead around raiding routes, alliances, rival clans, and how best to wield this newfound wealth. One crisp morning, when frost still clung to the grass, the chieftain called a council. The men arrived wrapped in heavy cloaks, their breath rising like smoke as they stepped into the hall. The air was thick with expectation. At the center, the chieftain stood beside a table scattered with gifts, arm rings, brooches, silver coins stamped with a foreign king's profile. They shone in the firelight, each piece carefully placed, each one deliberate. "These are not simply treasures," he said, running his fingers across the items. "They are tools." The warriors exchanged glances. "Tools for what?" one asked cautiously. "For shaping the north." A soft murmur rippled through the room. The chieftain continued, "With this silver we can bind men to us. We can reward loyalty, strengthen alliances, expand our influence beyond this fjord." He lifted a heavy silver ring, thick, beautifully engraved, a mark of wealth that only the most powerful leaders could give. "A gift such as this is not a simple gesture," he said. "It creates obligation, and obligation creates power." He set the ring on the table with a quiet thud that echoed like prophecy. The men understood. This was no longer about celebrating a successful raid. This was about building a legacy. Already, whispers had reached them that rival chieftains coveted their fortune. Already, envoys arrived seeking marriage ties, land agreements, shared ventures. Already, the North was shifting, slowly tightening its grip around this new currency of control. But power never flowed in one direction. Farther inland, other chieftains watched with narrowed eyes, their pride stung by the sudden rise of this once modest settlement. They gathered in their own halls, speaking in clipped tones about restoring balance, about reminding the fjords of old loyalties and forgotten promises. In smoky corners of these rival halls, men muttered, "They think themselves above us now. They believe a little silver can buy respect. We must answer this, before their influence spreads too far." Old rivalries stirred, new tensions simmered, and the chieftains who had risen on silver began to understand that fortune invited not just followers, but enemies. Yet not all power was forged through conflict. Some leaders sought advantage through cunning. One chieftain, a man whose hair had long since turned gray, but whose mind remained sharp as a whetted knife, began sending messengers to smaller villages scattered along the coast. His strategy was subtle. He offered modest gifts, promised trade benefits, and whispered gently of the prosperity that awaited those who aligned with him. These villages, weary of harsh winters and meager resources, listened. A few accepted, a few hesitated, a few wondered what their loyalty might truly cost. Slowly, quietly, a network of influence began to take shape. But back in the main village, where silver gleamed beneath torchlight and the chieftain's hall swelled with activity, the greatest transformation was unfolding. Not in the warriors' ranks, not in the training grounds, but within the chieftain himself. He had once been a man content with leading a single fjord. His goals were simple: protect his people, honor his ancestors, feast when the harvest was good, survive when it was not. But now he tasted something different. He felt it in the weight of each silver ring he gifted. He heard it in the lowered voices of men seeking his favor. He saw it in the faces of neighboring leaders who approached him not as equals, but as petitioners. Ambition settled onto his shoulders like a cloak lined with warmth and danger. And like many cloaks, it began to fit a little too comfortably. He walked through the village with new certainty. Children paused when he passed. Merchants bowed lower. Warriors straightened as though hoping for his approval. Even the elders, once unafraid to speak their minds, now measured their words before offering counsel. This deference fed something inside him, something ancient, something that had slept for years beneath duty and tradition, a seed of power, a hunger to rise above not just his rivals, but every chieftain on the peninsula. The silver brought back from England had not simply filled his coffers. It had awakened his ambition. On the cliffs above the village, the quiet young warrior, ever watchful, ever thoughtful, observed the shifting tides with a growing sense of inevitability. He saw the chieftains' expanded authority. He saw the rival leaders stirring with suspicion. He saw young men training with a fervor that bordered on desperation. This was no longer a village preparing for another raid. This was a region preparing for a struggle of influence. The young warrior wrapped his cloak tighter against the wind, sensing where this path might lead. Power was a dangerous current. It lifted men up, yes, but it also dragged them under. And yet, it was impossible to deny. The North was changing. The leaders who could read the winds of change would rise. Those who could not would be forgotten. This chapter of history was no longer shaped by mere survival. It was shaped by ambition, by men who smelled power in the air and followed the scent into an uncertain future. The nights grew longer as autumn deepened, and with each passing evening the chieftain's hall glowed brighter, lit not only by fire and torchlight, but by the unmistakable shimmer of stolen gold. From far across the fjords, travelers said they could see the hall even before the village came into view, a warm, flickering beacon rising from the dark cradle of pine and stone. It had become a symbol of victory, of wealth, of a settling transformation sweeping through the north. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of it. Inside, the atmosphere felt thick with celebration. Not the simple joy of harvest feasts or the comfort of shared mead, but something grander, louder, more intoxicating. The raiders gathered around long wooden tables, their laughter echoing against carved beams. They boasted of English priors who trembled before them, of golden crosses torn from church walls, of villages whose surrender felt almost unreal. Each tale grew more elaborate in the telling, shaped by firelight and drink. Then the skald struck his harp. A hush rippled through the hall. His fingers moved gently across the strings, plucking out a melody as warm as the hearth. The notes drifted through the rafters like drifting embers, soft yet commanding. And then his voice rose, steady, rhythmic, carrying the weight of new legend. Across the sea they sailed, as wolves to sleeping sheep, where prayers met sharpened steel, and gold was theirs to keep. The hall roared, horns lifted in triumph. But behind the celebration, a subtle truth unfolded. No one here looked at the gold with reverence anymore. Where once they would have held each piece as if touching the sun, now they passed it casually between fingers, embedded it into jewelry, traded it for favors. The treasure had lost its sacredness, because abundance dulls awe. Wealth, once unimaginable, had become familiar. The chieftain sensed this shift and leaned into it. For every feast he held, he displayed the stolen riches with deliberate precision, laying out coins in careful lines, arranging jeweled relics where firelight could dance across them, hanging gilded ornaments along the pillars. This was not mere decoration. This was message. A message to his warriors. Follow me and you will be rewarded. A message to his rivals. Challenge me and you challenge prosperity itself. A message to the gods, some whispered, see how high we rise. Yet beneath all this pageantry lay something quieter, something few in the hall recognized. The gold did not simply reveal who had won. It revealed who would hunger for more. At one table, a group of young warriors drank with wild abandon. Their faces glowed with the fire's warmth, their eyes shining with naive pride. They clutched goblets adorned with gemstones, lifting them high as though testing how power felt in their hands. One slammed his cup down. We should return before winter, he declared. Why wait for spring? The sea is ours. The treasure waits. Another laughed into his mead, though his expression wavered. You say that now, but the sea in winter swallows ships whole. Then let it swallow cowards, the first retorted, sweeping a hand toward the treasure-laden hall. Do you want this once, or do you want it always? Around them others nodded, some eagerly, some hesitantly. Ambition was spreading, catching like dry grass touched by flame. But at another table, older warriors shared quieter reflections. Their eyes, lined by years of war and hardship, watched the younger men with a mixture of admiration and unease. "They celebrate as though the gods will always favor us," one murmured. His companion took a slow sip of mead. "Our luck has changed, that is true, but luck is a tide. It turns." "Not in their minds," the first replied, watching a youth lift a gold bracelet and study his reflection in its curve. "They believe the world opens for them, and perhaps it does. But the world does not open without consequence." The men fell silent, the crackle of the fire filling the space between their thoughts. At the far end of the hall, near the shadows cast by towering support pillars, the quiet young warrior sat once again observing the room. No mead touched his lips tonight. Instead, he watched with a stillness that belied his age. He saw the joy and the pride, but he also saw something deeper, an undercurrent of transformation moving through the hall like an invisible tide. This gold had been taken easily, yes, but nothing in life came without cost. Every piece of silver that clinked through the hall carried weight. Political weight, social weight, the weight of changing loyalties and shifting alliances. Wealth had become a chain linking men to their chieftain, linking settlements to his growing influence, linking ambition to future conflict. The young warrior's eyes drifted to the chieftain. The man stood tall, smiling broadly as he raised a golden chalice to his warriors. A natural leader, confident, commanding. But beneath that confidence lay something sharper, more dangerous. Control. Every horn of mead raised tonight strengthened his position. Every gift offered bound another man to his will. Every feast tightened his grip upon the north. This hall, lit by stolen gold, was more than a place of celebration. It was a throne room in the making. The young warrior inhaled slowly, letting the warmth of the hall wash over him. He understood now that this wealth would shape the future in ways none of the revelers could foresee. It would forge kings. It would fuel rivalries. It would spark wars. It would build legends. And it would demand blood. Not tonight. Not in this moment of laughter and soft music and glowing treasure. But soon. For no age of gold can exist without an age of consequence. He rose quietly, leaving the hall as voices swelled into another song. Outside, the night air bit at his skin, cold and pure. He looked back once, watching the flickering light escape through the carved wooden doors. Inside was wealth, ambition, power. Outside was the world still waiting to be changed. He stepped into the darkness with steady breath. The age of silver had begun, but the age of blood was soon to follow. Prosperity had brought celebration, but prosperity also brought something far older. Something woven into the bones of the North long before gold ever touched its shores. Pride. And where pride lived, feuds followed. In the weeks after the longships returned, alliances strengthened, yes, but suspicions also sharpened. Rival chieftains eyed each other with a new nervousness, each wondering who now possessed more wealth, more warriors, more influence. The silver had elevated many, but it had not elevated them equally. Some men felt slighted, others felt threatened, and a few saw opportunity where others saw danger. The first spark came quietly. It began with two brothers, sons of a chieftain from the neighboring fjord. They visited the village to congratulate the raiders and attend the feasts. At first, they smiled easily, raising their cups in friendship. But as the celebrations continued, envy simmered beneath their laughter. They watched how the hall gleamed with English treasure. They listened as warriors boasted of wealth beyond imagining. They saw their own men whispering, weighing possibilities, wondering whether they served the right leader. One night, as mead warmed the hall and torches cast long shadows across the floor, the elder brother leaned close to the younger. "If we do not rise with them," he murmured, "we will be left behind." The younger frowned. "We have our strength, our land. Strength means nothing if our warriors envy theirs. Land means nothing if our halls are empty of silver." His fingers drummed anxiously against the table. "The North changes," he said softly, "and we must change with it. But ambition, like silver, often cuts deeper than intended. The dispute that followed began with harsh words, spoken too loudly over emptying mead horns. It escalated quickly. Two warriors arguing about who deserved more of the raided treasure, tempers inflamed by pride and drink. Shields slammed against tables. A knife flashed, and in the space of a breath, blood stained the wooden floor. The hall erupted. Men leapt from their seats, some rushing to separate the fighters, others shouting threats, a few already reaching for weapons. The music faltered into silence. The chieftain rose with thunder in his voice, demanding order, but the damage was done. One warrior was wounded, another stormed out, and the seeds of resentment took root. Word spread swiftly across the fjords. By morning, the incident had grown into a story of betrayal, twisted, stretched, reshaped by fear and rumor. They insulted our clan. They struck first. They tried to steal what was ours. They showed their true colors. Each side told the tale differently, and as the stories diverged, so did the loyalties. Soon, other tensions surfaced. A farmer accused a visiting trader of undervaluing English silver. A blacksmith refused to honor an old agreement, claiming the balance of power had shifted. Two rival families reignited a feud long thought buried, now fueled by the question of who had contributed more to the raid. Even the simplest exchanges, mead shared, glances traded, gifts given, carried new and precarious weight. The North had tasted wealth. Now it tasted division. One afternoon, storm clouds gathered low over the mountains as two clans met on the riverbank. A meeting meant to settle a dispute over raiding rights. Young warriors stood at the front, tense and restless, hands near their axe handles. Older men watched carefully, their years of experience telling them that peace balanced on the thinnest of blades. When words failed, as they so often did, voices rose. When voices failed, threats were made. And when threats failed, blood spilled. It began with a single shove, a single drawn knife, a single cry. Then the riverbank erupted into chaos. Shields clashing, fists flying, warriors tumbling into the icy water. The roar of the river swallowed their shouts, carrying the sound downstream like a warning to every settlement along its path. Though the skirmish was brief, its meaning was not. The wounds inflicted that day were not deep, but the grudges were. And in the North, grudges were as enduring as the stones that lined its fjords. Back in the village, the young warrior watched all this unfold with growing unease. He saw how swiftly ambition, once ignited, could twist into rivalry. He saw how men who had feasted together days before now avoided each other's gaze. He saw how the chieftain's smile had grown tighter, more guarded, as he tried to maintain control over a shifting landscape. One evening, as the hall prepared for yet another feast, the young warrior walked outside, seeking the clarity of cold air. The mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and ancient, their peaks veiled by mist. He wondered what they would think of this age if they had eyes to see. They had watched men rise and fall for centuries, and for the first time he understood why. Prosperity had not united the North. It had divided it. Because wealth did not change men, it revealed them. It revealed their ambitions, their grudges, their fears, their hunger, and once revealed, such things could never be hidden again. He stood there for a long time, listening to the distant echo of arguments leaking from the hall. The sound carried across the water like a faint, unsettling omen. Tonight, voices clashed. Tomorrow, blades might. And beyond the horizon, England still waited, rich, soft, and tempting. The young warrior's breath curled in the cold night air. Silver had been won. Blood had been spilled. And the path to power was becoming clearer, and more dangerous with every step. The fjord stretched out beneath the early morning sky, its waters still and dark as polished obsidian. Mist curled gently across the surface, rising in delicate tendrils that seemed to whisper of distant places. It was the kind of morning when the world felt suspended, caught between breath and silence. But beneath that silence lay movement, change, restlessness. For the North was no longer content with its own shores. The raid on England had shown the Vikings something they had never fully grasped before. The world beyond was open, not guarded, not unreachable, not mythical, just there, waiting. The rivers that once served merely as pathways between villages now seemed like threads connecting them to far greater destinations. The sea, once feared for its storms and fickle temperament, now beckoned like an old friend promising new wonders. Every current, every tide, every horizon shimmered with possibility. It was in this atmosphere of awakening that the young warriors began to prepare, not for survival, not for simple raiding, but for journeys shaped by ambition. Across the village, preparations unfolded with quiet urgency. Longships were inspected with reverent care. Their wooden hulls, carved and weathered, gleamed with fresh coats of sealant. Their dragon-headed prows stared out at the fjord as though sensing a coming voyage. Ropes were replaced, sails patched, oars sanded smooth. Each sound echoed through the village like the heartbeat of a world in motion. The blacksmith's forge glowed from dawn until dusk. Sparks leapt in frantic bursts as he hammered new blades, sharper, lighter, meant for faster fighting and longer journeys. The young watched him with reverence, understanding that each sword carried its own destiny. Nearby, the older warriors consulted maps etched on tanned hides, rough sketches of coastlines, rivers, and foreign settlements, drawn from memory and skaldic lore. Their fingers traced routes not yet traveled. North of England, there are villages, one said, tapping a spot along a jagged shoreline. Easy to reach if the winds favor us. Farther south, rich monasteries, another murmured. Walls of stone, but nothing we cannot break. The Franks, a third added thoughtfully. Their rivers reach deep inland. If we navigate carefully, their voices blended into a tapestry of plotting and possibility. It became clear that the Vikings were no longer preparing for a raid. They were preparing for a campaign. In the evenings, when torches illuminated the paths between houses, the younger men gathered by the water's edge. They stood in small groups, gazing at the horizon with eyes full of restless hunger. One of them tossed a stone into the fjord, watching the ripples expand. "Do you ever think," he asked softly, "that this place is too small for what we're becoming?" The others looked toward the mountains, ancient, imposing, familiar. But then they looked back to the sea, vast, open, unknown. "The world is large," another replied, "and we have only seen a corner of it." A third spoke, voice threaded with awe. "Imagine what lies beyond Ireland, beyond Francia, beyond the lands we've only heard about in stories." Their imaginations stretched farther than their fathers ever could, farther than the borders of the maps, farther than fear. Because once a man has crossed the sea, his mind can never return home. Not all watched the sea with excitement. Some watched it with unease. Elders gathered near the hearth, their murmured concerns weaving together like threads of smoke. "We have tasted victory," one said, staring into the fire. "Now the young believe it is their birthright." Another nodded slowly. "They do not remember the years of hardship. They do not know humility. Ambition drives them," a third warned. "But ambition can blind." Yet even as they spoke, the elders knew their words were like waves against stone. Soft, fleeting, easily ignored. The tide of change had already risen too high. The younger generation did not seek permission. They sought direction, and the sea offered it freely. By the end of the week, a new sound filled the village. The rhythmic chant of warriors training beside the longships. Their voices rose and fell with each synchronized movement. Hop, drive, hop, drive. Oars dipped into the water in perfect unison. Their muscles strained, their breath synchronized, their focus absolute. These were not boys pretending to be raiders. They were men preparing to shape history. Their sweat darkened the wood. Their hands blistered and bled. Their bodies grew stronger, honed by repetition and resolve. Nearby, the chieftain watched with a calculating gaze. Every oar stroke, every shout, Every gleam of determination fed his vision for the future. He saw not a village of farmers and fishermen, but a force, a fleet, an army in the making. He saw lands across the sea not as distant places, but as potential holdings, territories to be plundered, controlled, perhaps even ruled. The chieftain breathed deeply, the salt wind filling his lungs. Opportunity, he murmured, tasting the word like warm mead. It lies in every direction. And still, apart from all this movement, the quiet young warrior observed. From the cliffs, he watched the longships cut through the fjord during training. From the shadows of the hall, he watched men pledge loyalty in exchange for silver. From the forest trails, he listened to the wind carrying distant whispers of change. He saw more clearly than the others. These new roads of river, of sea, of ambition would not only lead outward, they would also lead inward, into the heart of the North itself. Opportunity brought wealth. Wealth brought ambition. Ambition brought conflict. And conflict shaped legends. He closed his eyes, letting the cold wind press against his skin. The Vikings were no longer bound to the hardships of the past. They were stepping onto paths paved by fire, paths that would carry them across continents and into the chapters of history yet to be written. The world was opening, the North was rising, and the next steps would echo far beyond the fjords. For every river was now a road, every coastline a promise, every horizon an invitation. Opportunity had become destiny, and destiny had begun to stir. The first snow of the season drifted down softly, settling upon rooftops, boats, and pine branches with gentle patience. It gave the village a quiet, fragile beauty, one that might have reminded its people of simpler winters, when survival was the only goal and community the only wealth. But this year, the winter air felt different. It was colder in ways the wind could not explain. For wealth, once welcomed, had begun to reveal its sharper edges. The silver gained from England no longer sat proudly on the chieftain's tables for all to admire. Instead, it trickled into private hands, hidden behind heavy doors, exchanged in whispers beneath the carved beams of the hall. And as silver changed hands, so too did men. It happened first among the warriors, where once they trained as brothers, pushing, laughing, shouting encouragement across the training grounds. Now they eyed one another with subtle calculation. They compared arm rings, measured gifts received from the chieftain, gauged their standing not by strength or honor, but by the glittering proof wrapped around their wrists. "I brought back twice the silver he did," one muttered angrily as they sharpened their blades. "Yet he received a larger ring." Another shook his head, bitterness tightening his jaw. "Favor. That's all it is. The chieftain's favor counts more than what you earn." The words were quiet, but the resentment behind them was not. Once, warriors competed for pride. Now they competed for wealth. And wealth, unlike glory, did not inspire unity. It inspired envy. Among the villagers, the change was just as stark. A fisherman, long known for his generosity, now refused to lend even a spare net unless payment was offered, preferably in English coin. A family that had always shared winter stores with neighbors began keeping their doors closed. Their windows shuttered, their voices hushed. Even conversations changed. People no longer spoke of weather, family, or upcoming festivals. They spoke of silver. Always silver. How much this man had received. How much that family possessed. Whether one clan secretly held more treasure than another. Some tried to conceal their growing greed. Others did not bother. One cold afternoon, two women argued in the village square, voices rising above the whistle of the wind. "My husband risked his life for that treasure," one shouted. "And mine did not?" the other snapped. "If anyone deserves more, it is us. You think too highly of your family." Their quarrel spread like frost across stone. Neighbors stopped to watch. Friends took sides. Old friendships cracked beneath the strain. Prosperity had not enriched them equally, and every inequality widened the distance between them. The chieftain felt this shift more than anyone. At first, He had believed wealth would unite his people under a single powerful banner. He imagined strengthening his village, expanding his influence, preparing the North for an era of greater reach. But now he saw the truth. Wealth had become a wedge, a silent silver blade splitting his people from within. He paced the hall each evening, his footsteps echoing beneath the carvings of dragons and beasts. He felt the weight of leadership settling heavily on his shoulders, the kind of weight even silver could not lighten. Prosperity breeds discontent, he murmured to himself one night. But even as he recognized the danger, he could not resist the allure of his growing authority. He distributed wealth with increasingly careful precision, rewarding loyalty, punishing hesitation, elevating those who supported his vision, and quietly sidelining those who did not. Each decision strengthened his control. Each decision also tightened the coil of tension winding through the fjord. The chieftain believed he could manage it, control it, bend it to his will, but ambition, once unleashed, belongs to no man. On the outskirts of the village, the young warrior watched the unfolding transformation with a quiet sorrow. He understood something others did not. It was not the gold that corrupted men. It was the belief that gold defined their worth. He saw it in the way warriors now walked with stiff pride, as though their rings were more important than the strength of their arms. He saw it in how villagers bowed lower to those with more wealth, their respect shifting like reeds in the wind. He saw it most clearly in the eyes of the chieftain, eyes that had once held calm certainty but now glimmered with restless calculation. The young warrior walked along the icy shoreline, listening to the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots. The sea lay still, frozen at its edges, reflecting the pale winter sky. Just weeks ago, this water had felt like a path to opportunity. Now it felt like a mirror showing what the North was becoming. Wealth had not brought peace. It had brought comparison. Comparison had brought envy, and envy had brought division. He knelt beside the shore, scooping a handful of snow, letting it melt slowly in his palm. He thought of the raiders celebrating under the glow of stolen gold. He thought of the chieftains forging alliances with silver as their hammer. He thought of the whispered arguments, the cold stares, the quiet resentments building like storm clouds. This was the true price of prosperity. Not the risk of battle, not the blood spilled on foreign shores, but the wounds inflicted at home. Wounds invisible yet deep, slow, spreading fractures that splintered unity. Wounds that would not bleed, until the day they suddenly did. The young warrior stood and brushed the snow from his hands. He knew what lay ahead. More raids, more wealth, more ambition, and with them more corruption. The North was rising, yes, but a rising tide lifts more than ships. It lifts buried things too: greed, rivalry, the hunger for power. The young warrior gazed across the frozen water, his breath a soft cloud in the cold air. This new age would not be shaped by swords alone. It would be shaped by what men did with the wealth those swords won. And wealth had begun to change the North in ways no one could yet predict. Winter settled fully upon the North. Snow lay thick along the rooftops, clinging to pine boughs like threads of frozen silk. Frost traced delicate patterns across every window, turning the village into a quiet world of pale light and muted breath. Yet inside the chieftain's hall, warmth and movement thrived. The fires burned high, the voices carried low, and silver, always silver, glimmered wherever the light touched. But now something had changed. Wealth was no longer displayed openly for celebration. It was displayed with purpose. For the chieftain had discovered the most ancient truth of leadership. Power is not held. Power is given and taken through the bonds between men. And nothing forged those bonds more tightly than a gift. Not a simple offering of kindness, but a deliberate act of binding. A ring. The tradition was old, older than memory, older than carved halls, older even than the stories the skalds recited by firelight. A war leader gave arm rings of silver to those he trusted most. In return, the warrior pledged loyalty, duty, and strength. But now, after England, the meaning had deepened. Arm rings were no longer symbols. They were currency, tools, chains woven from precious metal. The chieftain understood this better than anyone. One evening, he stood before a gathering of warriors, a wooden chest at his feet. His expression was calm, measured, but his eyes held a glint of deliberate intent. "You have served me faithfully," he said, his voice echoing beneath the carved rafters. "And our village grows stronger because of your courage." He lifted the lid. Inside, silver rings lay coiled like sleeping serpents. The warriors inhaled sharply, some with excitement, others with alarm. They knew what these rings meant. Not just honor, but obligation. The chieftain reached inside and held up the first ring. Its engraved surface caught the firelight, glowing with warm brilliance. "Kjartan," he said, calling forth a tall warrior with broad shoulders and eyes like winter ice. Kjartan stepped forward, kneeling as the chieftain placed the ring around his wrist. "With this gift," the chieftain declared, "you bind yourself to my side in all ventures. Your strength becomes mine. My fortune becomes yours." A murmur rippled through the hall. Another ring was lifted. "Eirik." Another. "Sten." Another. "Haralf." One by one, the warriors came forward, kneeling, accepting the ring, rising with a new weight on their arm and a deeper weight upon their heart. Because every ring was a promise, and every promise carried a price. Those who received the gifts felt a rush of pride. They belonged now not just to the village but to the chieftain himself. Their loyalty was valued, their strength recognized. But those who did not receive rings, they felt something entirely different. Their gazes shifted, subtle, sharp, wounded. They wondered why they had been overlooked. They questioned their worth. They doubted their chieftain's faith in them. Silver elevated some, and isolated others. Outside the hall, in the cold winter air, whispers spread as easily as frost. Kjartan grows too close to the chieftain. Eirik says they will sail soon, without telling the rest of us. If the rings bind men to him, who will follow the old ways? He is building not a band of warriors, but a court. And they were right. The chieftain was not simply preparing for another raid. He was shaping his future one wrist at a time. He gave rings to the boldest warriors. He gave gifts to families whose support he needed. He offered silver to craftsmen whose skills strengthened his influence. He whispered promises to neighboring clans whose cooperation could expand his reach. This was no longer leadership. This was strategy. A new kind of politics was forming, one not ruled by bloodline alone, but by the silent power of obligation. The young warrior observed all of this with a thoughtful, troubled gaze. He saw men walk differently now, those with rings holding their heads higher, those without clenching their jaws in quiet resentment. Ambition and envy had already seeped through the village like winter wind. But now something else had taken root. Division. The young warrior knew what the chieftain was building. Not just an army, not just a loyal retinue, but a foundation for something far larger. A domain. A network of alliances that stretched beyond blood and tradition. A structure of influence forged from silver. The young warrior watched the chieftain speak with Kjartan, leaning close, sharing private intentions. He watched other warriors glance over with narrowed eyes, studying the ring on Kjartan's wrist with envy and distrust. These rings did not simply grant loyalty. They demanded it, and demanded it at the cost of unity. He understood now that the rise of the ringgiver was not merely a cultural shift. It was the birth of a new hierarchy, one shaped not by lineage, but by wealth and ambition. One night, as snow drifted silently against the hall walls, the young warrior stepped outside. The moon cast a pale, shimmering path across the fjord. The longships sat in the cold water like sleeping beasts. He closed his eyes, letting the night air fill his lungs. The north was changing, too quickly, too deeply, too dangerously. The bonds that once held clans together were loosening, replaced by new chains woven from silver. Some men would rise in this new age. Some would fall. And some would burn with desires that no mead or treasure could quench. The young warrior opened his eyes. He knew this truth now, Ring-givers forge warriors, but they also forge kings. And kings reshape the world. The North was on the brink of such a reshaping, and the path ahead would glimmer with silver, but flow with blood. Winter deepened, settling over the North like a great white shroud. Snowdrifts piled against the walls of longhouses, smoke curled in thin strands from every hearth, and the fjord froze at its edges, its stillness broken only by the distant groan of shifting ice. But beneath this blanket of quiet, something restless stirred. The season that had once brought unity, when men gathered close for warmth, shared food, and faced hardship together, now highlighted the fractures spreading through the land. The people were no longer one people. Not truly. The desire that wealth awakened had begun to divide them in ways no storm ever could. Desire for wealth, desire for influence, desire for respect, desire for power. A North divided by desire is a North waiting for fire. It began subtly. A warrior refused to join the winter hunt, claiming he had earned enough silver from England to rest. A craftsman demanded higher payment for repairs, arguing that the chieftain's treasure had raised the price of everything. Neighbors questioned whether allegiance to their own clan was wise when wealth now flowed elsewhere. The simplest interactions, sharing mead, offering help, trading goods, became heavy with suspicion. "Why should I help him?" one man muttered. "He did not stand with us at the feast." "She received gifts from the chieftain," another whispered. "She thinks herself above us." "Do they plan to join the next raid without telling us?" Every whisper fed the growing divide. What had once been a single community now felt like many small islands, each drifting farther apart with every passing day. Beyond the village, the tension grew even sharper. Rival clans, once bound by mutual respect and occasional alliance, now scrutinized one another with hungry eyes. Wealth had redrawn invisible borders. It had redefined who held power and who wanted to take it. One chieftain, far to the north, sent a messenger demanding tribute. "If you wish to keep your silver," the message read, "share it." The reply came in the form of a returned messenger, bloodied, bruised, and silent. A message without words. Another clan fortified its borders, building wooden barricades along the forest paths and stationing guards where none had stood before. "We protect what is ours," they declared. Yet another clan sent quiet invitations to neighboring families, urging them to settle within their lands, promising protection and advantage. Lines were forming, lines of allegiance, fear, and ambition. The North had not seen such movement since the old wars, long remembered only in brittle elders' tales. Inside the chieftain's hall, the division was felt most clearly. The ring-givers, those chosen with silver, formed a tight circle near the hearth. They spoke in low tones, planning future raids, discussing the chieftain's growing influence, imagining a future shaped by their own loyalty. But across the hall, men who had received no rings, those overlooked, ignored, or forgotten, watched with quiet resentment. They drank less mead, spoke fewer words, moved with stiff shoulders and darting eyes. Their distrust grew heavier each day, settling into their bones like winter frost. One evening, as the fire crackled and the hall buzzed with murmured conversation, a young warrior approached the chieftain. "Why them?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the ring-givers. The chieftain studied him for a long moment. "They have proven themselves," he replied. "They strengthen our future." "And the rest of us?" the young warrior asked again, his voice steady but edged with hurt. "You will prove yourselves in time." The chieftain turned away, signaling the end of the conversation. But the young warrior's eyes lingered, darkening with realization. Divisions had not happened by accident. They had been created, shaped intentionally, methodically, by a leader who sought more than simple command. He sought control. Outside, beneath the pale moonlight, the quiet young warrior, observer of storms, student of silence, walked along the frozen shoreline. The light of the hall spilled faintly across the snow, flickering like a beacon distorted by frost. He felt the tension in the air, felt it in the way men spoke, in the way they avoided one another's gaze. in the way the winter wind carried echoes of whispered arguments. "You feel it too," came a voice behind him. He turned to see one of the older warriors approaching, the kind of man whose years carried wisdom etched into every scar. "It is not the snow that chills the village," the older man said softly. "It is the division." The quiet young warrior nodded. "When men desire the same thing," he murmured, "they turn upon each other, especially when that thing is wealth," the elder added. "And wealth earned in blood." He paused. "Blood binds men, but it also divides them." They stood together in silence, watching the moon's reflection tremble on the thin ice. "This is only the beginning," the elder said finally. "More silver will come, more raids, more power." He met the younger man's gaze. "And with each piece of silver, another crack will form." The young warrior inhaled deeply, feeling the truth of those words settle heavily inside him. Wealth had awakened ambition. Ambition had awakened rivalry. And rivalry had begun to carve lines through the north. Lines that could harden into fissures deep enough to split communities apart. For the first time, he understood the full cost of the age they were entering. It was not the raids. It was not the danger of foreign shores. It was the danger within themselves. Men no longer fought the sea or the cold or hunger. They now fought each other, quietly, subtly, inevitably. Not for survival, but for superiority. A north divided by desire could not remain at peace. And somewhere on the horizon, beyond the frost and the fjord, destiny waited, shaped by ambition, sharpened by rivalry, and destined to ignite into something far greater than any of them yet realized. The young warrior closed his eyes as the wind whispered across the snow. The world was preparing for change. Not a gentle change. A storm. And it was coming. The long night lay heavy over the north. Stars glittered like shards of ancient ice, scattered across the black sky with deliberate care. The moon hung low, casting a pale shimmer across the frozen fjord. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as though listening for what might come next. It was on nights like these, quiet, cold, and untouched, that the young warrior walked alone. He had grown up among these cliffs and forests. He knew the groan of ice beneath the water, the faint howl of wolves in the distance, the way the wind curled around the mountains like an old spirit searching for stories. Yet these familiar sounds no longer grounded him. They pressed him forward. There was something in him the others did not share, something restless, patient, and sharpened by insight rather than pride. Whereas other young men dreamed of silver and quick glory, he found himself dreaming of something far more difficult to name. Not riches, not fame, not the fleeting triumph of a raid. He dreamed of destiny. He paused on a high cliff where the world stretched wide before him, mountains rising like ancient guardians, forests shivering beneath snowfall, the vast sea reaching into the horizon with an endless, beckoning silence. Below him, the village glowed with firelight. Tiny, warm, flickering flames. Safe, small, temporary. But beyond was the vast unknown. The warrior's breath misted in the cold air as he thought of all he had witnessed in recent moons, the celebrations that had turned into division, the rings that bound men with invisible chains, the quiet resentment simmering beneath every feast, every council meeting, every exchange of silver. He saw clearly what most could not. The north was rising, but it was rising in many directions at once. Ambition pulled at every man like tides pulling at drifting ships. Warriors chased glory. Chieftains chased power. Villagers chased comfort. Rival clans chased advantage. But no one was looking beyond the horizon. Except him. He did not seek to become rich. He did not seek to become feared. He did not even seek to be admired. He sought purpose. A place where everything he had learned, every quiet observation, every hidden truth, might become something larger than himself. He placed his gloved hand against the cold stone of the cliff. A man could chase silver his entire life and die forgotten. A man could chase fame and be remembered only in a single hall. But a man who chased destiny, he changed the world. In the days that followed, he watched more carefully than before. He watched the ring-givers gather in corners, whispering plans they believed secret. He watched warriors compare their gifts, their pride growing even as their unity weakened. He watched elders shake their heads at the shifting tides, powerless against the rising storm of ambition. He watched the chieftain most of all. A man once content to lead a single fjord now walked with the restless hunger of someone who believed himself meant for more. Each decision he made was no longer for the village, but for the image of the future he saw only for himself. The young warrior respected strength. He respected vision. But he also understood something the chieftain did not. Strength alone could not bind a people. Wealth alone could not unite a land. Ambition alone could not create a legacy. Only purpose could do that, purpose shared widely enough to shape a world. And that purpose was still missing. One evening, as the sun bled red along the horizon, the young warrior found himself standing before the longships. Their hulls glowed softly in the dying light, their carved dragon heads seeming almost alive. He brushed his hand along one of the prows. These ships carried men across seas. But what carried men across ages? He closed his eyes. He saw a different world in his mind, a north not divided by silver, but gathered beneath a single purpose. A future where raids were not acts of desperation, but steps toward something greater. A future where one leader or one idea could elevate an entire people beyond the limits they had always known. He did not know how such a future would begin, but he felt the pull of it deep in his bones, as ancient as the stones beneath his feet. He felt the truth that every great change begins with a whisper, a quiet thought, a determined heart, a step taken when others hesitate. He felt that whisper inside him now. Later that night, he returned to the cliffs. The moon shone brighter now, silvered and serene. He looked again toward the horizon, where sea met sky in a thin, luminous line. And something shifted in him. Not a decision, not yet, but an understanding. He would not let the north crumble under the weight of wealth. He would not let ambition tear apart the people he had grown up among. He would not let destiny pass them by while they quarreled over silver. He would rise, not today, not loudly, not in a blaze of sudden glory, but slowly, quietly, purposefully. The world was on the edge of change. Someone would shape it. Someone would lead it. Someone would carry the North into an era beyond anything it had known. He inhaled deeply, his breath disappearing into the night like a vow. He did not yet have a name that would echo through the sagas. He did not yet wield the fame of kings or legends. But deep in his heart he knew he was meant for more. More than silver. More than feuds. More than the narrow ambitions of men blinded by wealth. He was meant for destiny. And destiny, patient and vast, was beginning to look back at him. Winter held the north in its icy grasp, yet beneath the stillness something vast and unseen began to stir, like the deep shifting of earth far below frozen soil. Change, once invisible, now whispered through every fjord, every hall, every flickering torchlight. And though snow softened every roof and quieted every footstep, the people could feel it. The world would not remain the same. Not after England. Not after silver. Not after ambition had awakened in so many hearts. The North had entered a new age. An age gilded in treasure and shadowed in danger. An age of gold. And an age of blood. The longhouses glowed softly at dusk, their windows leaking warm light into the darkening snow. Families gathered around hearths, sharing food and stories as they always had. But even these oldest rituals carried a new tension. Voices were quieter. Eyes drifted toward the chieftain's hall with unease. Children listened closely to the tones of their parents, sensing that something had shifted. For the first time in generations, winter was not the greatest threat. Men were. Wealth had changed the rhythm of living. The hunter who once shared his catch now counted favors. The craftsman who once worked for pride now worked for coin. The warriors, once united in brotherhood, now measured each other by the shine on their wrists. Even the elders, whose wisdom had guided their people through storms and famine, found their voices softened by uncertainty. They had lived long enough to see the North tested by hardship, but they had never seen it tested by fortune. Prosperity, it seemed, was a colder winter than any snow. In the chieftain's hall, the transformation was most profound. The walls glittered with gold, crosses, chalices, ornaments taken from distant monasteries. What once symbolized plunder now symbolized something far more complex. Power, authority, ambition. Each piece of treasure was a marker of influence. Each gift given was a thread woven into a web. Each ring clasped around a warrior's wrist was a contract, silent, heavy, binding. The hall echoed with feasts and celebrations, but beneath the drumbeats and songs, tension coiled like an unseen serpent. Some warriors sat tall at the tables, rings shining in firelight. Others sat in the shadows, ignored and embittered. Some chieftains arrived with gifts and smiles. Others sent messages filled with veiled threats. The hall had become more than a gathering place. It had become a battlefield. One fought with glances, alliances, and silent vows. And in the center of it all stood the chieftain, his gaze steady, his hand firm, believing himself the architect of a new era. He did not yet see how fragile his creation truly was. Far beyond his hall, the north stretched out in frozen silence. In some settlements, warriors trained relentlessly, inspired by tales of easy victory and unimaginable treasure. They dreamed of crossing the sea again, of finding new lands, weaker foes, richer spoils. In others, fear took root. Fear that the powerful would grow more powerful still. Fear that rivalry would ignite into war. Fear that the silver, once a blessing, had become a curse spreading through every home like frost. For desire did not spread evenly. Some had more, some had less, and sometimes the smallest inequalities grew into the greatest divides. From high upon the cliffs, the young warrior who sought destiny watched all of this unfold with a quiet, steady gaze. Snowflakes drifted around him, catching in his dark hair, settling upon his cloak. He did not move, even as the wind reached colder fingers across his skin. He had stood here many nights before, but tonight felt different. Weighted, deliberate, as though the world itself held its breath with him. Below, the village flickered with small lights. Above, the stars shimmered indifferently. Around him, the north waited. He could feel the truth of it, vast, heavy, irresistible. This age, born from England's defeat, was only beginning to reveal its shape. What the people saw as treasure, he saw as tinder. What others believed to be victory, he recognized as spark. A single successful raid had changed the course of the North, yes, but it was men's desires and the conflicts they bred that would change it even more. He watched the faint trail of smoke rising from the chieftain's hall and imagined the whispers inside. Plans for future raids, disputes over wealth, alliances formed from fear, promises made from hunger, loyalties bending beneath the weight of expectation. He understood what many did not. Gold could build, gold could inspire, but gold could also corrupt. And where corruption grew, blood followed. Not immediately, not loudly, but inevitably. He exhaled into the freezing air. His breath hung before him like a ghost before dissolving into the night. He did not yet know what role he would play in the storm to come, but he sensed, deeply, wordlessly, that the destiny stirring inside him would one day collide with the forces now shaping the North. Not to add to the chaos, but to give it direction. For every age of gold eventually demands a guiding hand, and every age of blood eventually calls for someone strong enough to bear its weight. Back in the hall, the skald began a new song. His voice rose gently, weaving through the rafters, threading through the tension like a soft thread of prophecy. Silver shines and shadows grow, the hearts of men now ebb and flow. From gold is born both feast and fight. From blood, the dawn of future light. The room listened in stillness, a rare, fragile moment of unity, but unity born from fear, not peace. When the last note faded, the chieftain lifted his horn. Smiling, proud, ambitious. He saw the age of gold. He did not yet see the age of blood, but the young warrior did. He saw the divided loyalties. He saw the hunger in men's eyes. He saw the future tightening like a drawn bowstring. He sensed, too, that this story, the story of how wealth reshaped the North, was merely a prelude. For beyond this winter, beyond these tensions, beyond the glitter of English treasure, another age awaited, one that would call warriors across seas, topple kings, forge new realms, and carve names into stone and saga. The North stood on the edge of that age now, glimmering with gold, trembling with blood, and the world would soon feel the force of what had begun here. Quietly, slowly, inevitably, an age rising from fire and frost, an age shaped by greed and ambition, an age that would give birth to legends. The young warrior stepped back from the cliff's edge, the wind carrying his breath into the dark. The age of gold had come. The age of blood was coming. And destiny, ancient, patient, was waiting for him.